Poetic Justice came out in 1993 and it stars Janet Jackson, Tupac Shakur. It's directed by John Singleton, who had made waves with his debut a few years earlier with Boys in the Hood, which was a critical darling. But critical reception was kind of mixed with Poetic Justice, and critics couldn't help themselves from comparing it unfavorably to Boys in the Hood. Peter Travers of Rolling Stone criticized Poetic Justice for wrong turns and right-minded preachiness. Richard Schickel of Time panned the film, and he said, "What must be said is that the new movie is simply awful. Poorly structured, vulgarly written, insipidly directed, monotonously performed." Leonard Claddy of Variety said, "Though aiming to create a feel for the locale, Singleton periodically loses sight of audiences unfamiliar with the colorful lingo. Poetic Justice has a lot to commend, but discipline is not high on the list. That flaw will be a major stumbling block toward wide appeal, and overseas prospects seem particularly remote." So when I was reading these reviews, what was apparent to me was that movie-going audiences loved Boys in the Hood for its gritty, realistic portrayal of violence in rough black neighborhoods. And it was glaringly obvious to me that this is what everyone wanted or expected Poetic Justice to be. All these negative reviews said something along the lines of, this movie's not violent enough, it's not gritty enough, or it's not gangster enough. But I found Poetic Justice to be super authentic and genuine, not necessarily in some portrayal of rough inner city Los Angeles, but it was actually the dialogue and chemistry between Tupac and Janet Jackson. Critics still found issue with the language of Poetic Justice being inaccessible. It's perhaps too black, too whatever. It seemed like everyone was able to recognize John Singleton for being this artistic directorial genius, but at the same time, they wanted to pigeonhole or typecast him as the Boys in the Hood director. It's okay if you don't love Poetic Justice. It's okay to even think that Poetic Justice is bad. I think it's kind of a mid movie. But what kind of struck me is that audiences went in expecting something else entirely from what Poetic Justice actually is. It made me feel like I would be so frustrated if I was John Singleton. Like, look at the poster of this film, look at Janet Jackson. Why were movie-going audiences and critics expecting Boys in the Hood out of this movie? Like, what did they think Poetic Justice was gonna be like? When John Singleton spoke about it, discussing the film's 20th anniversary, he mentioned that in 1993, black female leads were rare and he wanted to give a voice to young African-American women. He also spoke of the decision to have Janet Jackson wear the box braids, which are now iconic. It was a collaboration between himself, Janet, the dance choreographer Fatima Robinson, and a dancer named Jossie Harris. A lot of white movie-going audiences seemed to want like a sad, traumatic story like Boys in the Hood, which Poetic Justice is not. It's a fun movie. Clearly, everyone involved had a lot of fun making it, and it was kind of just this, maybe a love letter to a lot of aspects of sort of black culture in the 90s. And this movie has now become a cultural icon. And I think there's something to learn here from Poetic Justice about expectations of what largely white audiences expect out of black artists versus what the artist wants to create. And this is where relatively obscure author Percival Everett comes in. And this is also where my analysis comes in. So Percival Everett's Erasure satirizes the dominant strains of discussion related to the publication and reception of African-American literature. You might be familiar with Erasure if you watched the movie American Fiction, which came out in 2023. The protagonist is an academic professor of English literature and a novelist. The protagonist is named Thelonious Monk Ellison. And Monk has published some extreme high literature, for example, like a retelling of Greek mythology, specifically the myth of Greek god Dionysus, which is basically Percival Everett looking into the camera, speaking directly to the reader, because in real life, Percival Everett wrote a book about Dionysus. In 2013, he gave an interview where he spoke on the topic of race, and he mentioned this experience. He says that he wrote a book about Dionysus and the publisher turned it down, and the editor wanted to know what that had to do with black people. And he said that he thought, wow, I'm relegated to writing about only things that deal with black people. In the interview, he says some really insightful things, which I'll link in the description because it sums up a lot of what I'm trying to say, but it's Percival Everett, so it's articulated much better. So check it out, listen to Percival Everett in his own words. Maybe I clipped it into this video, maybe I didn't. Maybe I would clip it into this video, but I still don't really know how YouTube works with other people's media. I don't want to bother with that. He says, often any kind of American story deals with race in some way. The thing that amuses me is that there's all this talk of a post-racial America, which kind of makes no sense, because as soon as you utter post-racial, then you're already talking about a racial America. Anthropologists gave up notions of racial difference in the beginning of the 20th century, but the culture can't. The whole notion that you can write about any one people is kind of not only obscene, it's absurd. Do white artists get pigeonholed into talking about the white experience? Do you think if I wrote a book or if I directed a movie, would publishers come back to me and say something like, oh, this is interesting, great work, but what do you have to say about white people? What do you have to say about white men? Or how does this relate to the white experience or the white male experience? This is a little tongue-in-cheek or a rhetorical question, of course not. So the book Erasure takes this idea to a ridiculous and hilarious place where the protagonist, frustrated with how publishing houses find his writing to not be black enough, of course, completely ridiculous, because the protagonist, Monk, he writes novels which are highly academic, philosophical, often with reference to Greek mythology and literary theory. At some point in the novel, Monk complains about how he found his book about Greek mythology in the African American literature section at the bookstore, which is completely absurd. But again, I'm not even making this up. This, in many ways, he's telling the story, the real life actual story of his experience as an African American writer. It's fair to assume that some or a lot of the ridiculous stuff that happens to Monk in the novel, or maybe some of the ideas that Monk has, is one for one what Percival Everett has potentially experienced in real life, or at least what he's thought. Of course, it's what he's thought. That's why you write. So when the protagonist, Monk, is faced with increasing financial obligations, he decides to write the novel that the white publishing industry and audiences want to hear from a black author. He writes a quote-unquote black novel called My Pathology, which is an exaggerated story about a young black man who fathers multiple children by multiple women and falls into a life of crime. It relies heavily on African American English and incorrect phonetic spellings. This satirizes how these works are often interpreted by white audiences. It at the same time makes white people validated in their casual racism of lowered expectations for black people. But at the same time, it makes them feel good about themselves for reading it and feeling compassion about the story that they're reading. They or we feel like if I read this totally exaggerated work, which is steeped in a culture that they know nothing about, they can kind of give themselves a pat on the back for exhibiting some empathy and learning about someone else's experience. And so this novel within a novel, My Pathology, is in the tradition of books like Sapphire's Push or Richard Wright's Native Son. James Baldwin explores this idea in his essay, Everybody's Protest Novel, from his book, Notes of a Native Son. He repudiates the character of Bigger Thomas in Native Son as a tragic character, quote, not because he is cold or black or hungry, not even that he is American, black, but that he has accepted a theology that denies him life, that he admits the possibility of his being subhuman and feels constrained, therefore, to battle for his humanity according to those brutal criteria bequeathed him at his birth. Baldwin in the essay goes on to say that failure of the protest novel lies in its rejection of life, the human being, the denial of his beauty, dread, power, in its insistence that it is his categorization alone, which is real and which cannot be transcended. Everett follows up on these ideas in Erasure with the book within a book, My Pathology, where he takes the baton even further, is in his commentary on the audiences of these novels. In Erasure, the book that he wrote as a joke ends up becoming wildly successful, by far his most successful work, and it even gets optioned for a film, wins awards to his surprise. And to me, the butt of the joke in this novel are these sort of bookish, white liberal types who pontificate on their compassion for the downtrodden and minorities. They eagerly devour books like My Pathology that sort of present this caricature of black struggle and trauma. White liberals can read these books, pat themselves on the back for reading them, and probably discuss the book with other, mostly white liberals. Something like My Pathology perfectly satisfies their lust for reading about black trauma or struggle, and it trivializes and condenses that minority experience, perhaps in a dehumanizing way, but it also gives those readers what they want because it validates their low expectations of minorities too. This sentiment is perfectly encapsulated with a fictional review of My Pathology by Stag R. Lee that Everett includes later in Erasure. By the way, the protagonist uses Stag R. Lee as a pen name, and he changes the name of the book from My Pathology to Fuck. The review reads as follows, which, by the way, this is in Percival Everett's words, but speaking from the point of view as some literary critic raving over his book that he wrote as a joke. Quote, "There is so much excitement over this new novel by unknown Lee that it is difficult to write a review which approaches objectivity. But that is the point. The novel is so honest, so raw, so down and dirty gritty, so real that talk of objectivity is out of place. To address the book on that level would be the same as comparing the medicine beliefs of Amazon Indians to our advanced biomedical science. This novel must be taken on its own terms. It's a black thing. The life of Van Gogh Jenkins is one of sheer animal existence, one that we all can recognize. Our young protagonist has no father, is ghetto tough, and resists education and reason like the plague. It is natural, right for him to do so. He is hard, cruel, lost, and we are afraid of him, that much is clear. But he is so real that we must offer him pity. He is the hood whom Dirty Harry blows away and we say, good, you got him, then feel the loss, at least of our own innocence. Van Gogh has faux babies by 4 different mothers. He pays no child support, has no job, and no ambition except that he is on the verge of becoming a criminal. His mother, whom he stabs in the novel's opening dream sequence, arranges employment for him. He goes to work for a wealthy black family with a beautiful daughter who soon becomes the target of Van Gogh's burgeoning criminality. The characters are so well drawn that one often forgets that fuck is a novel. It is more like the evening news. The ghetto comes to life in these pages, and for this glimpse of hood existence, we owe the author a tremendous debt. The writing is dazzling, the dialogue as true as dialogue gets, and it is simply honest. Fuck is a must-read for every sensitive person who has ever seen these people on the street and asked, what's up with him? Oh, when I was reading Erasure, I thought, fucking yikes. This review within the book stuck out to me as the moment where it was kind of like, you know, if this has been going over your head by this point, the joke is on you probably. And it reminded me of this scene from the 1997 film Starship Troopers, which was directed by Dutch filmmaker Paul Verhoeven. He grew up in Nazi-occupied Netherlands, and in his movies, he explores themes like corporate power, authoritarianism, and especially within Starship Troopers, he explores the theme of fascism. Starship Troopers, the movie, is in fact supposed to be viewed as a meta film which depicts what the highly militaristic United Citizen Federation would make about itself. The characters are like mind-numbingly one-dimensional and boring. The acting was generally panned for being wooden, and the movie has no-name actors who had no credentials other than offering only a all-American, superficial Aryan stereotype of beauty. The movie Starship Troopers genuinely lacks humanity, and it's unnecessarily violent. The action scenes are legitimately boring and tiresome. I would say Starship Troopers, as an action movie, is undeniably bad. Paul Verhoeven, the filmmaker, with Starship Troopers, he basically is holding up a mirror to American society with this satirical, jingoistic action blockbuster, basically saying, don't you realize, like, the United States is the United Citizen Federation. This is a reflection of the movies we make about ourselves. And American audiences of the 90s were so oblivious to the possibility that this could be the US being depicted in the movie, that the US could resemble the sort of fascist dystopian society depicted in the film. And the satire went completely over everyone's heads. It was a pretty ballsy move for Verhoeven to basically create a bad movie on purpose as satire, and it took years, if not decades, for a critical reevaluation to recognize the movie as for what it is. In my opinion, and I watched this in the 2020s, so there's been quite a few decades of kind of American empire, America turning even more blatantly into kind of a United Citizen Federation. I kind of thought the fascist imagery and the satire is pretty heavy-handed, and it was almost ham-fisted. Near the end of the film, this military intelligence psychic of the United Citizen Federation named Carl Jenkins, who's played by Neil Patrick Harris, comes into a scene, and he's decked out entirely in this ridiculous Nazi regalia. It's basically like a SS uniform. And in this scene, the satire is laid down so strong that it almost removes you from the film at the moment. And it's a clear statement from the film. To me, my interpretation of it is, if you haven't gotten the point by now, the joke is probably on you. So yeah, what I'm trying to say kind of is this scene in Starship Troopers, Neil Patrick Harris in the Nazi regalia, and then Percival Everett with this, with this review of my pathology being sort of so heavy-handed and almost ham-fisted of, this is exactly what critics think of sort of this kind of protest novel, this Push by Sapphire, Native Son. This is kind of what maybe white or sort of liberal bookish type audiences think of these books. Starship Troopers is to fascism what my pathology is to racism. Casual racism of lowered expectations, quote unquote ghetto novels, satisfying these lowered expectations for white people's enjoyment. It's kind of gross, and Percival Everett's satirization of this is, I think, absolutely masterful. I've read 5 of his books already in 2025. Erasure was definitely my favorite. Check it out. For sure, if you don't have time to read it for some reason, if you don't want to read the book, watch the movie American Fiction. It's also good. I also liked that movie. A little more real quick on Percival Everett. I got put onto him this year from reading James, which is getting a lot of buzz right now. I really enjoyed it. It's a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from Jim's perspective. It was awesome. It's so hot right now. It seems like Percival Everett is getting a little more recognition, which is great. I think you should read James. It's a phenomenal book. Percival Everett is a phenomenal writer. I'll mention a few other Percival Everett books that I think deserve some shine too. I also read I Am Not Sidney Poitier. It's about the tumultuous life of this character named Not Sidney Poitier, who's the beneficiary of an enormous estate. His mother had invested in Turner Broadcasting on the ground floor. He becomes extremely wealthy when it becomes successful. Or the mother becomes extremely wealthy when it becomes successful. The mother dies. And Ted Turner becomes Not Sidney's legal guardian. And Ted Turner, for some reason, is this prominently featured character in the novel. Percival Everett himself is even a prominently featured character as Not Sidney's professor when Not Sidney is attending Morehouse College. In the book, Professor Everett is like a complete fraud. Not Sidney's roommate is a fraternity brother named Morris Chesney, which is a little tongue-in-cheek. Like a million things going on. It's a brilliant book. I think it was certainly one of my favorites of Percival Everett, one of the favorite books I've read this year, period. There's these themes of identity crisis associated with racial performance. He plays around a lot with this idea of the guy named Not Sidney Poitier, who bears a striking resemblance to Sidney Poitier, the real Sidney Poitier. He has this huge inheritance. He's black, but he's raised by Ted Turner. There's a lot to say about this idea of the confusion of having an identity crisis one feels about performing the expectation others have with your skin and ethnicity. Like I mentioned earlier about Everett's contemplations on race in literature, it's not only obscene, but absurd to think that there's like a one-size-fits-all approach to the experience of a particular race or ethnicity, despite how badly white Americans might want there to be. Wouldn't it be nice as a white person to read one book about the black experience or a book about the Latino experience and then be like, okay, great, I can wipe my hands clean of any of my internalized racism because now I have successfully empathized with another perspective and now I basically know what it's like because I've read this comprehensive book on the black experience or the Latino experience or the female experience, whatever it may be. That's obviously not how it works. So yeah, just like in Erasure, I Am Not Sidney Poitier emphasizes the idea of black literature in more than just stories entirely about the concept of race. These are all tremendously entertaining books, intellectually stimulating, and funny. He's so freaking funny. Percival Everett's a really, really funny author. He's like, the type of writing you might even laugh out loud while you're reading it. It's funny and it's cutting. I also read The Trees, a super haunting story that kind of explores, it kind of evokes the American South's history of lynching. Not for the faint of heart. That one really stuck with me. Another book of his, Dr. No, is about a mathematics professor named Walla Kitu. He's an expert on the mathematical concept of nothingness, and he partners up with this like James Bond style villain to break into Fort Knox and steal literally nothing. It's a really zany book. That one was fun too. Quick sidebar as well. If you're a fan of Percival Everett already, and maybe that's why you clicked on this video, if you like Percival Everett, something tells me you'd also really, really enjoy Paul Beatty. And maybe another time I'll discuss his shit too. So to try to close my thoughts on Percival Everett, I find him to be a profoundly creative writer. I think he's super talented for what it's worth, if that means anything. He's not only one of the most talented writers that I have the pleasure of reading, but he's also rather accessible. In the books that I've read, the writing is quite accessible and fairly easy to understand, or mostly easy to understand and fun. At least what I've read of him so far. I look forward to exploring more of his bibliography, particularly some of his earlier works. And I would guess that the writing from his earlier career, which is less commercially successful than his current stuff, it might be more complex, more challenging, maybe more high literature, which I would certainly welcome. I almost feel guilty for only reading the very recent stuff so far. How much is he actually breaking the fourth wall in Erasure? Am I one of those naive readers that I'm talking about, patting themselves on the back for just reading the most accessible works? Maybe I'm part of the problem. I don't know. All I know is I'm having fun reading Percival Everett's writings, and it's making me reflect on stuff.